Picture a line of wagons stretching back 10 miles into the dust, families who have already crossed a continent, standing on the banks of a river they cannot walk across, waiting their turn on a wooden raft held together with rope and prayer. Some of them will wait for days. Some will lose everything they own when the current takes a wagon under. And almost none of them will ever be remembered for it, because the history books remember the railroads, the bridges, the highways, the things built to replace what came before. But before there was a bridge over almost any major American river, there was a ferry. And the story of those ferries, the men and women who ran them, the fortunes they made and lost, the enslaved people who used them to escape bondage, and the empires of steel and steam they eventually gave way to, is one of the most overlooked chapters in the entire story of how this country was built. This is the story of the forgotten ferry crossings that built America. Long before the United States existed, before there were 13 colonies or a single named road connecting them, the rivers of North America were the only real highways. They were faster than walking, safer than fighting through unmapped forest, and in a land with almost no bridges, they were often the only way across at all. Native peoples had understood this for centuries. Along the Great Lakes and the bays of the upper Midwest, Ojibwe paddlers regularly carried early settlers and their belongings across open water, guiding newcomers who had no idea how dangerous those crossings could be. On the Mississippi, other native communities developed an ingenious method for moving a horse-drawn wagon across raging water. They lashed two canoes together, side by side, and balanced the wagon's wheels one on each hull, floating the entire rig across current that could otherwise have swept a wagon and its family away in seconds. It was a solution born of pure necessity, and it worked. And when European colonists arrived and began pushing inland, they didn't invent a new way to cross the water. They borrowed this one, refined it, and turned it into a business. By the late 1660s, colonial governments up and down the eastern seaboard had already begun formally licensing the first ferry operations in what would become the United States. In 1669, the governor of the Delaware colony chartered a ferry crossing on the Christina River, and within a few decades, ferries were operating on the Delaware River between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, on the Schuylkill just outside Philadelphia, and across a growing web of rivers in Connecticut, Maryland, and Virginia. By the year 1700, there were already 11 separate ferry crossings operating across Connecticut alone. 50 years later, that number had grown to 26. By the end of the century, it had climbed to 30. These weren't luxury operations. Most of the earliest ferries weren't built by skilled shipwrights in a proper boatyard. They were rough, flat-bottomed craft built on-site by whoever happened to own the land at the crossing point, designed to load and unload as quickly as possible while carrying foot travelers, livestock, and heavily loaded wagons. And because a river too wide or too expensive to bridge could otherwise cut off an entire region from trade and travel, the person who controlled the ferry crossing controlled something enormously valuable. Taverns sprang up beside ferry landings. Roads were built specifically to funnel travelers toward them. In cities like Philadelphia, the ferry became such a foundation of daily commerce that when a proposal was finally floated in 1774 to build a bridge instead, it took 2 more years, and the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, before anyone actually built one, and even then, it was thrown together as a floating military bridge out of desperate necessity. One of these ferries would go on to become perhaps the most quietly mythologized in all of American history. In 1642, a Dutch settler named Cornelis Dirksen set up a simple rowboat ferry at the edge of what is now Brooklyn, carrying farmers, wheat, tobacco, and cattle across the East River to the fledgling Dutch outpost of New Amsterdam. For nearly 2 centuries afterward, that same crossing point kept operating, growing slowly with the city around it. Then, in 1814, the inventor of the world's first successful commercial steamboat, Robert Fulton, launched a steam-powered ferry called the Nassau on that exact stretch of water. It cut the crossing time to just a few minutes and could carry hundreds of passengers at once. And it changed everything. Within less than 50 years, sleepy little Brooklyn exploded into the 3rd largest city in the entire United States, built almost entirely on the fact that a person could now live across the river and reliably commute into Manhattan for work. Brooklyn had become, in effect, one of the world's very first commuter suburbs, and the humble ferry crossing was the machine that made it possible. That ferry became so central to daily Brooklyn life that it produced its own poet. A young newspaper editor named Walt Whitman rode it constantly, often climbing up into the pilot house just to take in the full sweep of masts, water, and sky around him. He later wrote that he had always felt a genuine passion for ferries, describing them as something like living poetry, an experience no bridge could ever replicate, because a bridge lifted you above the water while a ferry put you inside it, surrounded by its sounds and its constant motion. In 1856 he turned that passion into one of his most enduring poems, a meditation on time, connection, and the strange intimacy of sharing a river crossing with strangers who would ride the very same ferry decades after he was gone. And here is the twist that makes his story almost unbearably poignant: the very structure that would eventually kill off his beloved Fulton Ferry was already being planned in his lifetime. Construction began on the Brooklyn Bridge in the 1870s, and Whitman, by his own account, had no kind words for it at all. He didn't live to see the ferry's final run, that didn't come until 1924, but he lived long enough to watch the shadow of its replacement start to fall across the water he loved. While New York's ferries were shuttling commuters across a few thousand feet of river, an entirely different kind of ferry crossing was unfolding 1,000 miles inland, on a river so wide and so violent that it terrified almost everyone who had to face it. The Mississippi River was, by nearly every account from the era, considered the single most dangerous and difficult river in the country to cross, and it never stopped a single wave of settlers from trying anyway. Long before steam power arrived, travelers crossed on flat-bottomed boats that were rowed, pulled, or dragged hand over hand along a rope strung across the current. Some crossings used strange contraptions called flying bridges, essentially large skiffs tethered by chain to a buoy anchored in the middle of the river, letting the current itself swing the boat from one bank to the other. In the early 1800s, someone invented something even stranger: the teamboat, a vessel powered not by steam or sail but by mules or horses walking on a treadmill that turned a paddle wheel. As the wave of westward migration accelerated through the 1800s, the bottleneck at these crossings became almost unbelievable. Travelers sometimes waited in lines up to 10 miles long just to get a spot on a ferry across the Mississippi. Imagine that for a moment: an entire wagon train, stretching farther than the eye could see, every single person in it staring at a river they had to cross to reach the life they had risked everything to build, with no way across except a wait that could last for days. But not every ferry crossing in America was about commerce, or migration, or convenience. Some of them were matters of life and death in the most literal sense imaginable. Along the Ohio River, the line that, for decades, separated the slaveholding South from free soil in the North, ferries became one of the most dangerous and most vital tools in the entire Underground Railroad. Near Cincinnati, a crossing known as the Anderson Ferry became so associated with helping enslaved people escape that its ownership was deliberately changed in 1841, specifically to protect its ferry license from accusations coming out of Ohio. In the winter, when the river ran low or froze over, people didn't even need the ferry, they could simply walk across the ice into freedom. In April of 1853, a group of enslaved men, women, and children in Boone County, Kentucky, who came to be known as the Cincinnati 28, used exactly this kind of river crossing to escape together after a church meeting, vanishing across the water into Ohio in one of the largest single-group escapes recorded in the region. Further downriver, in an area known as Eagle Hollow near the Kentucky-Indiana border, an enslaved man named Richard Dailey took on one of the most dangerous roles imaginable. He ferried other enslaved people out to the middle of the Ohio River himself, where conductors from the free side would meet them and guide them the rest of the way. Nearly 50 enslaved people are recorded as having escaped from farms in that single county using routes like this one. And the Underground Railroad's use of ferries wasn't confined to the Ohio Valley. Along the Potomac River, at a crossing called Edwards Ferry, the ferryman himself, a free black man, was identified by contemporaries as a secret agent of the network, quietly receiving fugitives brought across the water and passing them on toward a canal that would carry them further north. Even the great arc of the Underground Railroad ran the opposite direction, too. In Texas, enslaved people fleeing not north to Canada but south to Mexico, where slavery was illegal, sometimes escaped by sneaking aboard ferries bound for Mexican ports, or, in a detail so desperate it is almost hard to comprehend, by floating across the Rio Grande on nothing but bales of cotton. Historians estimate that somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people escaped slavery this way, into Mexico, through a network of routes so secret that most of them left almost no paper trail at all. Every single one of these crossings depended on the same basic fact, that a river was both a barrier and a doorway, and the ferry, or the raw willingness to cross without one, was what turned a barrier into freedom. Then came 1848, and the discovery of gold in a small mill town called Coloma, California, and suddenly ferries became something else entirely, a fortune-making machine in their own right. As word of James Marshall's discovery on the American River spread across the country and then the world, tens of thousands of people converged on California by land and by sea, crossing deserts and mountain ranges to reach the goldfields, and every single one of them eventually had to get across a river to reach the mining camps. The very first recorded ferry operation in the Sacramento River Delta dates to 1848, the same year gold was found, and it was no coincidence. Enterprising operators realized almost overnight that they didn't need to pan for gold themselves. They just needed to control a river crossing that thousands of desperate, gold-hungry travelers had no choice but to use. Some of these ferry operators reportedly made more reliable fortunes charging tolls than most of the miners ever pulled out of the ground. For decades afterward, ferries remained a fixture of daily life across the Sacramento Delta, crisscrossing the maze of rivers and sloughs that fed into San Francisco Bay. It was only slowly, crossing by crossing, that the state of California began replacing them with bridges, a process so gradual that by the end of the Second World War, there were still 2 ferries operating in Sacramento County alone. And nowhere did the ferry become more central to an entire region's identity than San Francisco Bay itself. The first ferry across the bay is recorded as early as 1820, but it was the gold rush that turned the bay into the busiest ferry crossing system on the planet. In 1850, the very year California became a state, a steam ferry called the Kangaroo began running between San Francisco and the Oakland estuary, and from there, an entire industry exploded outward. By the late 1800s, 22 separate passenger ferry companies were operating on the bay, alongside 5 more that carried only automobiles, serving roughly 30 different destinations. Most of these lines were built and run by railroad companies, using ferries to extend their tracks across water that no train could cross on its own. At its absolute peak, in 1935 and 1936, somewhere between 50 and 60 million passenger trips were made across San Francisco Bay by ferry every single year. Every day, 250,000 people passed through the city's ferry building alone, boats arriving and departing roughly every 4 minutes around the clock, with streetcars waiting on the other side leaving every 20 seconds to whisk commuters onward. For a few remarkable years, San Francisco Bay carried what may have been the single greatest water transit system anywhere in the world. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. The Golden Gate Bridge opened in 1937, following the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge the year before, and the decline of the ferry system that followed was staggeringly fast. Within just over 2 decades, the ferries had all but vanished from the bay. By 1958, the very last scheduled ferry crossings shut down entirely, replaced by buses rolling across the same bridges that had killed the boats in the first place. For nearly a decade after that, San Francisco Bay, once crossed by tens of millions of people a year by water, had no regular ferry service at all. Even the ferries that survived didn't survive unchanged, and one story in particular shows just how strange and eventful a single crossing's history could become. Across the harbor in New York, a separate ferry, the one connecting Staten Island to Manhattan, grew into one of the busiest passenger crossings in the entire country, carrying commuters across a stretch of water wide enough, and rough enough, that no bridge would ever fully replace it. Unlike the East River crossings that eventually lost out to the Brooklyn Bridge, the Staten Island Ferry never had a realistic bridge alternative for passenger foot traffic, and it grew instead into a full municipal operation, carrying tens of thousands of commuters a day across New York Harbor, past the Statue of Liberty, for a fare that eventually dropped to nothing at all. It is, in a strange way, the flip side of the Fulton Ferry story, proof that not every crossing was destined to be replaced, and that sometimes a harbor was simply too wide, too rough, and too central to a city's daily rhythm for any bridge to ever fully make sense. This pattern of replacement repeated itself across the entire country, again and again, almost like clockwork. A crossing too significant, too busy, too central to a region's economy to keep relying on wind, current, and a wooden hull, would eventually get a bridge, or a tunnel, and the ferry that had carried an entire community's hopes and commerce for 100 years would simply fade away, sometimes within a single generation. The people who had once waited in 10-mile lines to cross the Mississippi eventually drove across steel bridges without a second thought. The descendants of families who fled slavery across the Ohio River could one day cross that same water on a highway overpass in a matter of seconds. And in Brooklyn, the very bridge that Walt Whitman resented for killing his beloved Fulton Ferry ultimately couldn't kill it entirely. The ferry limped on for decades after the bridge opened, still preferred by horse-drawn wagons and carts that struggled with the bridge's steep approach ramps, before finally shutting down for good in 1924. But here is the part of this story that almost nobody expects: the ferries never fully disappeared. They simply waited. In San Francisco Bay, regular ferry service quietly returned in 1970, driven not by necessity this time but by a mixture of nostalgia, tourism, and a slowly dawning realization that the bridges everyone had built to replace the boats were now clogged with more traffic than they were ever designed to hold. In Brooklyn, more than 80 years after the last Fulton ferry pulled away from its landing, a seasonal water taxi began running the very same route in 2006, followed by year-round ferry service in 2011, and today, that same stretch of the East River that carried Dutch farmers, then steam commuters, then Walt Whitman himself, carries commuters once again. A handful of the oldest colonial-era ferry crossings in New England never stopped running at all. The Rocky Hill, Glastonbury Ferry across the Connecticut River, first established all the way back in 1655, is still in continuous operation today, believed to be the oldest ferry service of its kind anywhere in the nation, a single unbroken thread stretching from the earliest days of colonial settlement straight through to the present moment. So why does any of this matter now, in a country crisscrossed by interstate highways and spanned by tens of thousands of bridges? Because these forgotten crossings are, in a very real sense, the seams of the country, the places where an entire nation's expansion, its commerce, its migration, and its struggle for freedom all had to funnel through a single narrow point of water, and where ordinary people, often working entirely outside the historical spotlight, decided what would happen next. A ferry operator on the Ohio River could choose to look away, or could choose to risk everything by rowing a family of escaped enslaved people out to the middle of the current in the dead of night. A settler on the edge of the Sacramento Delta could choose to keep panning for gold, or could choose to build a raft and control the only way across the river for miles in either direction. A poet in Brooklyn could climb into a ferry pilot house at sunset and, in watching that same ordinary crossing thousands of other commuters made without a second thought, find in it something worth writing down forever. Bridges get their names carved into stone. Ferries rarely got remembered at all. But long before there was a single interstate highway in this country, it was these crossings, these narrow, dangerous, unglamorous stretches of water, that quietly stitched America together, current by current, crossing by crossing, one boatload at a time. If you had lived along one of these rivers 150 years ago, the Ohio, the Mississippi, the East River, the Sacramento, do you think you would have had the courage to be the ferryman who risked everything to carry someone else to freedom? Tell us what you think you would have done.